November 18, 1944. Somewhere over the western Pacific, a Japanese reconnaissance float plane droned above the endless blue. Below, the ocean shimmered in the sun, nothing moving but waves. The observer logged his message in careful handwriting. No enemy activity. Area clear. 48 hours later, the same coordinates lit up Japanese radar screens like a fever dream. Operators on outposts near Yap began calling headquarters, voices uncertain. Dozens of aircraft returns had appeared where their scouts had seen only water. The echoes clustered, vanished, reappeared. Some seemed to lift off from the sea itself. They recalibrated, checked connections, blamed humidity and ionization. "Ghost echoes," one technician muttered. Another wrote in the margin of his notebook, "Impossible." Phantom formation. The assumption was clear: faulty equipment. There was nothing out there but ocean. Except there was. What the radars couldn't yet resolve was not a fleet at sea, nor a natural island, but something entirely new, built by men who treated engineering as if it were a race against time. The United States Navy's Seabees, battalions of welders, mechanics, and heavy equipment operators, had learned to make resting places for the highways of air and water at a speed that belonged more to legend than to logic. They arrived where geography failed and simply made their own. In 48 hours, they could turn a lagoon into an anchorage, a reef into a harbor, a patch of empty sea into the beating heart of an air campaign. That is what was beginning now, the operation codenamed Ulithi Anchorage, a construction effort so vast and so quick that Japanese intelligence refused to believe the reports even after seeing them. To the scouts, it still looked like open ocean. But beneath the horizon, convoys of barges, cranes, and floating pontoons were already assembling in formation. The Seabees were coming, and wherever they went, islands followed. The convoys reached Ulithi before dawn on November 21, 1944. The first light revealed what, at a glance, looked like a mirage. A ring of coral no higher than a man's shoulders surrounding a lagoon 40 miles across. The water inside was calm as glass, deep enough to float an entire fleet. For the Seabees and Navy engineers aboard those ships, it was the ideal blank canvas, protected, central, and untouched. 47 ships entered the lagoon in single file that morning. Oilers, repair ships, floating cranes, and cargo vessels heavy with construction gear. Each carried its own blueprint section, pre-planned down to the last pontoon. To the men watching from deck rails, Ulithi seemed lifeless, just birds and breakers. But to the operations staff, it was already divided into numbered zones, every reef and sandbar mapped for immediate use. Orders were crisp and simple: anchor by grid. Begin offloading immediately. The Seabees didn't wait for ceremonies. Within an hour, landing craft began ferrying bulldozers toward the largest island, Mogmog, where command headquarters and recreation areas would rise. Others moved toward Falalop, Sorlin, and Azor, names few Americans had ever heard before that week. They had done this dozens of times since 1942. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan. Each operation had taught a painful lesson in logistics: the coral dust that chewed through machinery, the tides that stole equipment left too close to shore, the storms that undid weeks of work overnight. By Ulithi, the Seabees had learned efficiency the hard way. Their new system functioned like clockwork. Everything came prefabricated: steel airstrips, floating docks, pontoon bridges, packed in precise sequence aboard Liberty ships. When the first cargo hatches opened, men worked from a schedule that ran to the minute. Pontoons slid into the sea in numbered order, each stamped with its destination code. Welding crews followed, guided by chalk markings that told them which pieces to join before the next tide. The lagoon filled with noise, engines revving, acetylene torches hissing, the rhythmic crash of cranes unloading crates the size of houses. To nearby Japanese observers, few and far between after months of naval retreat, it must have seemed impossible that so much could materialize so quickly. The atoll had been empty one day. By the second, it pulsed with sound like a small city under construction. Fuel was the first priority. A fleet without fuel was dead weight, and the Pacific stretched too far for regular deliveries from Pearl Harbor. The solution was audacious: a floating fuel farm. Over 200 enormous barges were lashed together inside the lagoon, each filled with aviation gasoline or diesel connected by a web of hoses and valves. Pumping crews could refuel an aircraft carrier in mid-harbor without the ship ever docking. Next came maintenance. The Navy's floating drydocks, massive steel structures that could lift destroyers clear of the water, were assembled in sections towed from the Marianas. As soon as they were connected, ships damaged in combat began arriving for repair. For many sailors, it felt like returning to a mainland city. Hot meals, medical treatment, mail from home, even fresh water distilled on site. And still, the Seabees kept building. Within the first 48 hours, they had erected communication towers, radio shacks, and a weather station. Bulldozers scraped coral from Mogmog's interior to create storage depots. By the third day, the first Quonset huts, corrugated steel half-cylinders that could be bolted together in hours, stood in neat rows along the beach. Each hut became something essential: workshops, kitchens, power stations, hospitals. The pace bordered on reckless. Crews worked 12-hour rotations, sometimes longer, living aboard their ships or on hastily cleared patches of sand. Meals were cold rations. Sleep came in short bursts between equipment breakdowns. Yet morale remained high. Everyone knew this outpost would decide the tempo of the final campaign against Japan. By the end of that week, the lagoon had become the busiest harbor on Earth. Over 700 vessels anchored there: carriers, battleships, oilers, tugs, and transports, each serviced from floating piers built in those first 2 days. The newly completed airstrip on Falalop, less than 4,000 feet long, began handling liaison flights, patrol bombers, and transport planes bringing mail and parts from Guam. Japanese intelligence still couldn't believe the reports. Their last reconnaissance photograph of the area showed nothing but reef and surf. Now radio intercepts mentioned Ulithi Base, a name that didn't appear on any pre-war chart. To them, it was as if a new island had risen from the Pacific. The secret lay in modular design. Every pontoon, pier, and platform had been engineered in advance at stateside factories. Standardized dimensions allowed them to be bolted together like children's building blocks. The Navy called them pontoon assemblies, but among the men they had another name: magic boxes. They could become anything: a pier, a barge, a bridge, even a floating warehouse. At Ulithi, they became all of those at once. Night fell early near the equator. From the decks of arriving ships, the glow of welding arcs and floodlights made the lagoon look like a city afloat. The sound never stopped: chains clanking, generators rumbling, the faint hum of planes passing overhead. Somewhere on the eastern reef, a Seabee petty officer scratched a note in his log: "Built a port where there wasn't one." 24 hours. That note understated the miracle. In less than 2 days, the Navy had created a functioning base capable of supporting the largest fleet in history. Everything floated, yet nothing felt temporary. By late November, Ulithi was operational. Oilers refueled carriers that would strike the Philippines. Destroyers rotated in for engine repairs. Ammunition ships delivered ordnance around the clock. What the radar operators had mistaken for phantom aircraft was now fully real. Hundreds of planes taking off from the decks of carriers anchored in the lagoon. forming clouds of silver over the Pacific. From that moment onward, the war's geography changed. The Navy no longer needed to seize and fortify every island between Hawaii and Tokyo. They could build their own islands, anywhere, anytime. The Japanese never found an answer. Their charts still showed only open water at Ulithi's coordinates. Their pilots kept reporting it as empty ocean, even as American fleets launched daily raids from within it. It was the perfect illusion, one created not by trickery, but by industrial skill. In the after-action report filed weeks later, Admiral Chester Nimitz described Ulithi as a logistic miracle. He was only partly right. It wasn't a miracle. It was the end product of 3 years of relentless engineering evolution. But to the men who had seen only waves and sky before it appeared, it might as well have been magic. For the Seabees, it was simply another job finished. They packed their tools, loaded their bulldozers, and waited for the next set of coordinates, some other piece of empty ocean where America needed a harbor by tomorrow. By early December 1944, Ulithi had become something almost beyond comprehension, a floating metropolis without streets or buildings, yet more organized than most cities on land. The Navy officially called it a forward logistics anchorage. Sailors simply called it the biggest base you never saw. At any given hour, 700 ships lay moored inside the lagoon. Their silhouettes stretched from horizon to horizon. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, oilers, ammunition ships, and barges tied in clusters like neighborhoods. Each ship had its own function, each crew its precise schedule. The lagoon operated 24 hours a day, without pause or ceremony. There were no docks, no concrete piers, no warehouses in the conventional sense. Everything floated. Piers were made of steel pontoons bolted into rafts 200 feet long. Warehouses were barges with roofs welded on. Workshops were built inside floating drydocks. There were even floating bakeries, post offices, and refrigeration units. The sea itself was the foundation. Every movement followed an invisible timetable drawn by the Navy's Service Squadron 10, a logistical command led by Commodore Worrell Reed Carter, whose job was to keep the Pacific Fleet supplied, repaired, and fueled thousands of miles from home. His men called him the Mayor of Ulithi. He never slept more than 4 hours. His office floated aboard the repair ship USS Argonne, anchored near the lagoon center, from where he directed the largest naval supply chain in history. From Ulithi, fuel lines stretched across the lagoon like veins. More than 200 tanker barges fed an unending demand: gasoline for planes, diesel for ships, lubricants for engines. In a single day, the base could deliver 500,000 gallons of aviation fuel. Aircraft carriers came in empty and left within hours, decks stacked with bombers and fighters ready to strike. On the western edge of the lagoon, the Navy's largest floating dry dock, the ABS-D2, stood like an iron island. It could lift a battleship completely clear of the water for hull repairs. In December, the USS Missouri spent 2 days there before returning to bombard Luzon. Crews worked around the clock, welding underwater damage by floodlight. The dry dock itself had been built in 10 prefabricated sections, towed across the Pacific and assembled like a puzzle. Everywhere, the same pattern repeated: modular engineering, standard components, predictable results. The Seabees had learned that simplicity multiplied strength. If a pump broke, it could be swapped for another. If a barge sank, another could be lashed into place within hours. The Pacific War's speed depended on that redundancy. The numbers tell the story more clearly than adjectives ever could. By January 1945, Ulithi's daily consumption reached 3,000 tons of fuel and 2,000 tons of ammunition. Its floating workshops processed more than 20,000 repair orders a week. The fleet post office sorted 75,000 letters daily. Ships arriving from the combat zones around the Philippines brought their wounded, on some days over 1,000 men, who received treatment aboard hospital ships like the USS Sanctuary before being evacuated to Guam. Mogmog Island, once a sandbar, had become the recreation center of the entire Pacific Fleet. There were volleyball courts, outdoor theaters, a barber shop under a tent, and a beer beach where sailors could drink warm cans rationed 2 per man. Shore leave lasted 4 hours. After that, the launches took them back to the war. The whole system worked because of planning depth, the invisible architecture behind the pontoons and cranes. Each ship carried standardized spare parts and technical manuals that matched others across the fleet. A valve from a destroyer could fit a cruiser. A radio component from a repair barge could service a battleship. American industry had made everything interoperable, and Ulithi was the proof. The Japanese, still clinging to outposts across the western Pacific, couldn't believe it. Intercepted radio traffic from Truk in December showed complete confusion. One officer wrote, "The Americans appear to operate from nowhere." Their aircraft reconnaissance saw no major land bases, yet American planes struck daily from directions that defied explanation. Ulithi was invisible to them because it didn't look like a base. It looked like the sea itself. When the first kamikaze raids began in late 1944, the Navy braced for the inevitable. Ulithi was too large, too critical to remain unnoticed forever. The first attack came on March 11, 1945, when a Japanese pilot flying a twin-engine bomber penetrated cloud cover. 25 men were killed, over 100 wounded. For a moment, Ulithi fell silent. The illusion of complete safety was gone. But within hours, damaged crews and Seabees were already cutting away twisted steel. The Randolph returned to action less than 3 weeks later. That was Ulithi's defining pattern. Impact, repair, nothing ever stopped for long. The base's communication system rivaled that of small nations. 4 radio stations handled traffic from every fleet sector: orders, logistics, casualty reports, weather forecasts. To manage the volume, operators used what they called fleet mail code, a compressed format that fit an entire supply manifest into 2 short transmissions. The speed of information flow became as important as the physical transport of supplies. On Falalop, the Seabees extended the airstrip to 4,200 feet, capable of handling twin-engine patrol bombers. PB-4Y privateers and PBY Catalinas launched from there daily, patrolling thousands of square miles. These planes weren't glamorous. They didn't drop bombs. They watched for submarines, charted weather, and guided incoming fleets. The Pacific War's logistics had its own air force, and Ulithi was its hub. To understand the scale, you have to imagine the Pacific not as open water, but as a network of invisible highways. Each fleet movement, from Leyte to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, required fuel, ammunition, food, and maintenance flowing behind it. Before Ulithi, that flow broke every few thousand miles. After Ulithi, it became continuous. In January 1945, Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet assembled there before launching the campaign for the Philippines. 40 carriers, 18 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers, all serviced, refueled, and armed within one lagoon. From the air, it looked like the industrial coastline of an entire nation transplanted to the tropics. The men aboard those ships barely noticed the miracle beneath them. For them, Ulithi was a waypoint, a place to take on supplies, send mail, and catch a few hours' rest before heading back into combat. But for the Navy's engineers and logisticians, it was the operational pivot of the Pacific War. Every bomb that fell on Luzon, every sortie flown over Iwo Jima, every ship that sailed toward Okinawa drew its power from that anchorage. And still, to anyone without a chart, it remained invisible. The Japanese had maps of islands that no longer mattered, but none that showed Ulithi. It was geography rewritten in steel and fuel lines, a city built on water that the enemy couldn't see and therefore couldn't destroy. By early spring, Ulithi had become the single greatest concentration of naval power in history. More ships gathered there than at Pearl Harbor, San Diego, and Norfolk combined. The base consumed 1.5 million gallons of fuel every day. It repaired ships faster than the enemy could sink them, and it kept growing. For the Seabees who had arrived on that first morning, the work never really ended. Every week brought new projects, additional pontoons for drydocks, new fuel lines, expanded anchorage zones. They joked that the ocean had turned into a factory floor. From the air, the view had changed completely since the scouts' first report of no enemy activity. Now the lagoon shimmered with the reflections of hundreds of ships and aircraft, each one part of a machine so vast that even those operating it could barely grasp its scale. Ulithi had proven what the Seabees always believed, that logistics, not heroics, wins wars. By February 1945, Ulithi had evolved from a miracle into a machine, a living organism of steel, diesel, and discipline that stretched across 40 square miles of Pacific water. To outside eyes, it was just another anchorage, but to the American Navy it had become something far larger. A self-sustaining logistics ecosystem that could feed, fuel, and repair half the world's naval tonnage without touching land. Every week, convoys arrived from the United States and the Marianas, long gray lines of Liberty ships heavy with everything a fleet might need: food, shells, aviation fuel, spare engines, medicine, mail, lumber, even ice cream mix. The Navy had calculated that each man in the Pacific required 65 pounds of material every day. Multiply that by the thousands aboard the task forces rotating through Ulithi, and the result was an operation that defied all precedent. The arrival of a supply convoy followed its own ritual. At dawn, the horizon would thicken with the shapes of cargo ships, each towing barges or pontoons. Escort destroyers took station along the perimeter, while harbor pilots guided the first vessels through the narrow reef passages. Within hours, the lagoon turned into a hive of motion. Barges swarmed between ships, cranes swung cargo, and signal flags rose and fell like heartbeat pulses. Everything was timed to the minute. The Navy's Service Squadron 10 issued daily bulletins listing which ship received what and when. Ammunition had priority, then fuel, then food, and repair parts. The schedules ran for weeks ahead. Every department had its clock synchronized with the flagship USS Argonne. One missed delivery could delay an entire fleet movement, so precision became a form of survival. To maintain that precision, Ulithi depended on what the Seabees called floating factories. These were not ships in the traditional sense, but massive barges crammed with lathes, presses, and welding stations. If a destroyer needed a propeller blade replaced, the part was fabricated on-site. If a carrier lost a turbine blade, machinists aboard a repair ship could cast a new one within days. Nothing waited for shipment back to Pearl Harbor. Everything was built or fixed where it failed. Behind the visible operations ran an invisible chain of coordination, the Naval Supply Code. It was the quiet backbone of the Pacific War, a numbered language that translated the chaos of combat into a predictable rhythm of replacement. Every bolt, bearing, and cable had its supply code. Every warehouse barge kept duplicate ledgers, updated hourly by radio. If an aircraft engine failed on the deck of a carrier 2,000 miles away, its serial number could be transmitted to Ulithi, matched with a replacement in storage, and shipped out by the next courier flight. Ulithi's airstrip on Falalop became the Pacific's airborne lifeline. Transport planes, C-47s, R-5Ds, and Navy PB-4Y variants flew in endless circuits carrying personnel, mail, spare parts, and medical supplies. Each day hundreds of flights took off and landed on the strip carved out of coral by Seabees just weeks earlier. On average, A shipment requested by Fleet Headquarters in the Philippines arrived at Ulithi within 48 hours and reached frontline ships within 72. Nothing in German or Japanese naval doctrine even approached this level of logistical responsiveness. Their fleets depended on fixed ports. When those ports fell, their ability to fight evaporated. The American fleet had no such limitation. Its port could move, expand, or disappear at will. At night, the anchorage glowed faintly in blackout blue, thousands of deck lights dimmed to slits. Across the water came the sounds of compressors, hammering, and engines idling through the dark. The lagoon never slept. Crews worked around the clock under the equatorial heat and the brief squalls that swept in from the east. A destroyer could arrive at dusk, riddled with shrapnel, and by dawn be patched, refueled, and ready for combat again. The floating hospitals were another marvel of improvisation. Ships like the USS Samaritan and USS Bountiful anchored permanently at Ulithi, their wards always full. Each had operating rooms, X-ray units, and dental clinics. Many of their patients were not battle casualties, but construction workers and engineers, men injured by machinery, coral dust, or tropical diseases. These were the quiet sacrifices of the Seabees, whose battles were fought with tools instead of rifles. Even waste became part of the system. The Navy's sanitation crews designed floating sewage barges that processed thousands of gallons daily, using chemical treatment units powered by generators. Nothing could be allowed to pollute the lagoon. Its clear water was vital for refueling operations and engine cooling. The base's environmental management was decades ahead of its time, an engineered ecosystem sustained entirely by logistics. Admiral Nimitz himself visited Ulithi in March 1945. His barge moved slowly among the anchored carriers, battleships, and cruisers, while he stood at the rail, silent. Later, he remarked, "This is the war's real turning point. We are no longer fighting from islands. We are fighting from the sea itself." He wasn't exaggerating. From Ulithi, the Navy launched its final great campaigns, Iwo Jima in February, Okinawa in April, and the bombardments of Japan that followed. Each operation consumed millions of gallons of fuel and thousands of tons of ammunition. Without Ulithi's efficiency, such campaigns would have been logistically impossible. The Japanese Navy, once formidable, had ceased to exist as an organized force. Intelligence intercepts revealed despair among their officers. They called Ulithi the island that isn't there. Radar operators reported seeing hundreds of ships one day and none the next. For them, the Pacific had turned into a ghost sea, haunted by invisible harbors. What made Ulithi unique wasn't its size, but its adaptability. When the fleet's needs shifted, the base transformed itself overnight. When carrier task forces required faster turnaround, Seabees built additional mooring buoys and transfer docks. When fuel consumption outpaced delivery, engineers created a pipeline network linking storage barges into a single system with pressure equalization valves, an innovation no one had tried before. The supply ships themselves were miracles of planning. Each Liberty ship carried mixed cargo, part ammunition, part machinery, part food. Every crate bore a destination code matching fleet schedules months in advance. Cargo never sat idle. It moved like clockwork from ship to barge to unit. The human scale was just as extraordinary. Ulithi supported 30,000 men at any given moment: sailors, engineers, medical staff, pilots, and maintenance crews. Each lived in floating quarters, ate from galleys mounted on barges, and worked shifts that blurred day and night. Their lives followed the tides more than the clock. By April 1945, Ulithi's influence stretched across half the Pacific. The fleet that struck Okinawa sailed from its waters. The bombers that flew over the home islands were launched from carriers serviced there. Even as fighting reached its bloodiest phase, Ulithi's rhythm stayed steady. What few realized at the time was that this lagoon had quietly redefined naval warfare. Before Ulithi, fleets operated from bases. After Ulithi, bases operated from fleets. The line between sea and land had been erased by engineers. A month later, when news reached the anchorage of the victory at Okinawa, there was no cheering, just work. The same convoys unloaded, the same cranes swung, the same welders sparked through the night. The men understood instinctively. Their efficiency was victory. Every gallon pumped, every plate repaired. Every flight guided from that coral lagoon was a weapon. The Seabees often joked that they didn't win battles. They just made it possible for others to win them. But at Ulithi, even they began to sense that their work had tipped the balance of the entire war. By April 1945, Ulithi had reached its peak. The lagoon that Japanese scouts once marked as empty ocean had become the operational core of the Pacific War, a place where battleships, carriers, destroyers, and submarines moved in constant rotation, like parts of a single immense machine. Nothing comparable existed anywhere else on Earth. The anchorage stretched 40 miles from end to end. Over 1,000 vessels had passed through in just 1 month. The task forces that struck Okinawa supported the B-29 bombing campaign and prepared for the invasion of Japan, all staged from its calm blue water. Every round fired, every bomb dropped, every plane launched from the western Pacific carried some trace of Ulithi's supply line. When the Okinawa campaign began on April 1, 1945, the demands placed on the base defied all precedent. Within days, ammunition reserves fell to crisis levels. Fuel barges pumped around the clock. The floating drydocks worked 3 shifts, repairing ships damaged by kamikaze attacks and heavy seas. The ABSD-2 and ABSD-3 drydocks ran continuously, each lifting vessels that would once have required full shipyards. Destroyers came in holed and scorched, their plating twisted by suicide aircraft, and left seaworthy again within 48 hours. Even as the war's tempo reached its final crescendo, Ulithi never stalled. The supply codes kept their rhythm, the convoys kept coming, and the men worked with quiet precision born of exhaustion and pride. They knew by then that the system worked too well to fail. On April 9th, Admiral Raymond Spruance visited Ulithi after his flagship, the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, completed refit. He toured the repair docks, spoke briefly with the Seabees, and later wrote in his diary, "This lagoon is the greatest logistical achievement in naval history. It functions as if it has always existed." The illusion of permanence was deliberate. Everything about Ulithi was designed to look inevitable. The floating piers perfectly aligned, the radio towers standing like fixed structures, the airstrip handling flights as if it were carved from granite instead of coral dust. But behind that illusion lay the constant hum of improvisation. Nothing here was permanent. The pontoons that formed its docks would one day be unbolted, the barges towed away, the huts dismantled and reloaded. Ulithi existed entirely because the war needed it. The kamikaze threat hung over the base constantly. Japanese long-range reconnaissance aircraft occasionally spotted the anchorage, and sporadic attacks followed. On March 11th, as the USS Randolph was preparing to launch aircraft, a twin-engine bomber appeared out of low cloud and struck its starboard quarter. 25 men were killed instantly. The explosion tore a crater 40 feet wide through the flight deck. Yet 3 weeks later, after 24-hour repairs, the Randolph sailed again, refueled, rearmed, and fully operational. That incident hardened Ulithi's defenses, but never slowed its tempo. Anti-aircraft guns were mounted on the lagoon's perimeter ships. Radar pickets stationed 30 miles offshore tracked every unidentified contact. The men slept lightly, but they never left their posts. By June, as Okinawa fell, Ulithi was handling nearly the entire logistical load of the Pacific Fleet. At its height, The base stored 300,000 barrels of fuel oil, 100,000 barrels of aviation gasoline, 40,000 tons of ammunition, and provisions for 30,000 men. Floating bakeries produced over 60,000 loaves of bread a day. Refrigerated barges supplied meat and milk to ships that hadn't tasted fresh food in months. Mail arrived daily by air, sorted aboard the floating post office USS Ajax, and delivered directly to ships by launch. Everything that defined the American way of war, scale, system, and speed, was visible in that lagoon. For the Seabees, Ulithi became a symbol of what they had learned since Guadalcanal. That victory in the Pacific wasn't won by individual battles, but by logistics that made those battles possible. They had turned coral and seawater into the most efficient military base ever built, not through miracles or slogans, but through relentless process. When news of Germany's surrender reached the anchorage in May, the reaction was subdued. The work continued. The Pacific War still raged, and Ulithi remained its beating heart. The final test came in July 1945. The fleet preparing for the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, assembled in the lagoon. Nearly 1,200 ships filled the horizon. Transports, supply vessels, carriers, and battleships. Engineers laid additional moorings to handle the overflow. It was the largest single gathering of naval power in human history. But the invasion never came. On August 6th, the message arrived, a single line transmitted through fleet channels. Atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. No one in Ulithi yet understood what it meant, but they knew the war was changing. 2 days later came the second bomb, and then, on August 15th, the broadcast from Tokyo. Japan had surrendered. For a few moments, the lagoon was silent. Men stood on decks listening to radios, too tired to cheer. Then the horns began, hundreds of them, a deep, echoing chorus that rolled across the water. Ships fired blank salutes. Seabees stopped their machines and watched as the sun sank behind the lagoon's rim. The war they had built Ulithi to fight was over. What followed was the fastest demobilization in naval history. Within days, the same efficiency that had created Ulithi began dismantling it. Pontoon docks were disconnected and towed away. The floating fuel farm was drained and stripped for parts. The dry docks disassembled section by section, loaded onto transports bound for Guam and Pearl Harbor. By September, fewer than 100 ships remained. The once crowded lagoon fell quiet. The Seabees packed their bulldozers, rolled up steel matting, and boarded homebound vessels. Quonset huts were emptied, their contents crated for shipment or left behind to rust. The radio towers came down. The lights went dark. In less than 6 weeks, the greatest naval base in the Pacific simply ceased to exist. When a Navy reconnaissance plane flew over Ulithi in November 1945, it saw only outlines, faint scars on the coral where pontoons had once been anchored, tire tracks fading into sand, and a handful of huts collapsing in the sun. The sea had reclaimed what engineers had borrowed from it. The records remained. Between November 1944 and August 1945, Ulithi had serviced 5,500 vessels, issued 9 million barrels of fuel, delivered over 150,000 tons of ammunition, repaired 600 major warships, and processed 20 million letters. No enemy attack ever shut it down. No logistical failure ever stopped its output. For historians, Ulithi represented the moment when American engineering surpassed geography itself, when men learned to build civilization on water, sustain it under fire, and remove it when finished, as if it had never been there. For the Seabees who lived it, Ulithi was simpler. It was proof that with enough steel, grit, and will, you could make an island wherever you needed one. When the war ended, Ulithi vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. The lagoon that once held the might of the Pacific Fleet returned to silence. Its pontoons gone, its dry docks towed away, its radio masts dismantled and loaded onto cargo ships headed east. Within months, the sea erased the evidence. Fishermen returned first. They found mooring buoys adrift, oil drums half sunk in the shallows, and the coral still white where the Seabees had carved their airstrip. From the water, the lagoon looked unchanged. Only the veterans who had seen it at its peak could imagine what had stood there, a city of ships that had fed an empire of war. In the years that followed, Ulithi faded from public memory. Pearl Harbor remained famous, Iwo Jima became a symbol, but Ulithi, the quiet harbor that made victory possible, slipped into the footnotes of history. Yet every modern naval operation still carries its shadow. When the United States built floating bases during the Korean War, the blueprints came from Ulithi. When carrier task forces in Vietnam refueled at sea, they used methods first tested in that lagoon. Even today, the Navy's forward logistics model, mobile bases that move with the fleet, traces directly back to that experiment in 1944. The lesson endured because it was simple. Power means nothing without the ability to move it, feed it, and fix it. Ulithi proved that logistics, not firepower, decides how long a nation can fight, and whether it wins. A handful of rusted pontoons still lie in the coral shallows. Divers sometimes find them covered in barnacles, stamped with faint serial numbers. The water around them is clear and quiet again. But those numbers belong to a time when men built an island from steel, supplied half the world's ocean, and dismantled it before history could fully notice. For the Seabees who returned home, Ulithi remained a memory that words couldn't quite match, a place where the ocean became a workshop, where time itself seemed measured in gallons of fuel and tons of ammunition. Many never spoke of it afterward. They had done their job and left, as quietly as they came. But for those who understand the machinery of victory, Ulithi still stands as one of the great achievements of the 20th century. The island that wasn't there, the invisible harbor that changed the course of the Pacific War. Thanks for listening till the end. I put a lot of effort to bring you factually correct and lesser-known stories of the past. Subscribe my channel if you like this type of content.